Tom Brady finally admitted he spent his entire career convincing himself Peyton Manning was his enemy. The two most celebrated quarterbacks of their generation were locked in a 17-game war that defined an era. But the reason Brady manufactured this hatred reveals something darker about greatness that he hid until 2025. The newsletter that started it all. On July 21, 2025, Tom Brady published a post in his personal newsletter that did not arrive through a press conference, a televised interview, or a sit-down with a major network. It arrived in inboxes. The newsletter is called 199, a reference to the 190th overall pick the Patriots spent on Brady in the 2000 NFL Draft. The post itself carried the title, "Every Champion Needs a Rival," for a man whose post-retirement public image had settled into something polished, agreeable, and carefully managed. The contents of that post represented a departure. The subject was Peyton Manning. Not Manning the friend, the golf partner, the fellow Hall of Famer with whom Brady had been photographed smiling. The subject was Manning the competitor, and more specifically, the way Brady had chosen to think about Manning. Across roughly 15 years of direct competition, what Brady described was not a rivalry in the conventional sense. It was a deliberate psychological construction, built and maintained on purpose. Brady wrote that he made himself believe Manning was his enemy, not a respected opponent, not a worthy challenger, an enemy, and the framing he used to explain why he needed that enemy is where the story begins. Because Brady did not describe a hatred that came naturally to him. He described a hatred he engineered. The specific mechanism Brady detailed was a self-imposed narrative about status. Manning entered the league as the #1 overall pick in the 1998 NFL Draft, selected by the Indianapolis Colts out of the University of Tennessee. He arrived with pedigree, with an SEC quarterback's resume, with the expectations that come attached to being the first name called. Brady arrived as the 199th pick out of Michigan, a 6th-round selection who was not expected to start, let alone to define the position for 2 decades. Brady took that gap in draft status and weaponized it. He wrote that he convinced himself Manning didn't respect him, that Manning thought he was better, because he was a 1 pick from an SEC school. The crucial part of that admission is the qualifier Brady attached to it. He added the phrase, "or at least that's what I made myself believe." Brady was not reporting that Manning had disrespected him. He was reporting that he chose to imagine the disrespect because the imagined version was useful. That distinction is what makes the 2025 newsletter notable. For years, the public version of the Brady Manning story had been one of 2 respectful rivals who became friends once the competition ended. The newsletter did not erase that version, but it complicated it. It revealed that underneath the respect Brady genuinely felt, he had been running a second, private program, designed to override that respect during the hours that mattered. Brady explained the purpose of the constructed enemy in plain terms. The imagined disrespect created a sense of urgency to prove Manning wrong. It supplied the extra energy and motivation he said he needed to lock in, to focus, and to execute at a level high enough to beat Manning more often than Manning beat him. The hatred was not the goal. The hatred was fuel. He framed this as a requirement of elite competition rather than a personal quirk. Brady wrote that you have to allow your rivals to become your enemies, and he was specific about the word he wanted. True enemies in your mind and on the field. He allowed that you can and should respect them, but he insisted you cannot look at a true rival as friendly competition. The friendliness in Brady's account was a luxury he could not afford while he was still playing. There was a line in the newsletter that extended this idea beyond Manning specifically and into Brady's entire approach to his career. He stated that during his playing days, he had no real friends on any other teams, only teammates. Everyone outside his own locker room occupied a different category in his mind. This was not a statement about Manning alone. It was a description of a worldview in which the entire rest of the league sat on the other side of a line Brady drew on purpose. Here is the detail worth holding on to early, because it reframes everything that follows. Brady did not describe the enemy framing as a burden he carried. He described it as something he was grateful for. He called the rivalry with Manning a gift to his NFL career. The man he spent years framing as a threat became, in retrospect, the resource Brady credited with forcing him to dig deeper. The enemy was the gift. That contradiction sits at the center of the entire newsletter. The mechanism of that gift was off-season work. Brady described how having a specific target, a specific rival whose existence demanded a response, forced him into the kind of preparation that happens away from cameras and crowds. The enemy gave him a reason to work when nobody was watching. Manning, in this telling, raised the floor of Brady's commitment simply by continuing to be excellent across the field from him. To explain that the enemy framing was not unique to him, Brady placed himself in a lineage of competitors known for the same trait. He invoked names from across sports. He compared the mindset to the way Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Tiger Woods, Nolan Ryan, and Roger Clemens approached their own careers. These were figures defined by an internal drive that often looked, from the outside, like an obsession with proving someone wrong. Brady was positioning his manufactured enmity not as a flaw, but as a shared signature of the historically great. The reason this admission registered as significant in the coverage that followed is that it cut against the narrative. Both men had spent years building after they retired. The two had been photographed together, had appeared at each other's events, and had publicly traded warm words. The story had calcified into something comfortable. Brady's newsletter took that comfortable story and inserted a harder truth beneath it, namely that the friendliness on display now was preceded by a deliberate adversarial posture that lasted as long as they were both still playing. The contrast Brady drew was explicit. He acknowledged that the underlying respect and admiration for Manning as a competitor was always there and that it grew over time. He was not claiming the respect was fake. He was claiming that during competition he suppressed it, overrode it, and replaced it with the constructed enemy because the respect alone would not get him where he needed to go. Two things were true at once, and Brady was now describing the second one out loud. The numbers that gave this rivalry its weight are worth establishing here, because they are the scoreboard against which Brady measured the success of his enemy's strategy. Across their careers, Brady and Manning faced each other 17 times between 2001 and 2015, counting both regular season and playoff meetings. That is a remarkable number of direct confrontations between two quarterbacks, sustained across a decade and a half, two franchises for Manning, and the entirety of one franchise's dynasty for Brady. The overall result of those 17 meetings favored Brady. He held an 11-6 head-to-head edge over the full span of the rivalry. Within that record, certain splits stood out. Brady was particularly dominant in the regular season and especially at home, where the conditions and the crowd at Foxborough tilted in his favor. The enemy strategy, by Brady's own accounting, was producing the result he designed it to produce. He was beating Manning more often than Manning beat him, which was the stated goal of the entire psychological exercise. But the record was not a clean sweep, and that is part of why the rivalry mattered. Manning held his own advantages in specific settings, particularly on the road and in certain postseason moments where the stakes were highest. The enemy Brady constructed was not a man he could simply overpower. Manning kept winning enough of the meetings, and winning enough of the biggest ones, that Brady never got to relax. The rivalry stayed alive because neither man ever finished it. That sustained tension is exactly what Brady credited with extending his own commitment. The comparison most often reached for in describing this rivalry placed it alongside the defining pairings in other sports. Observers compared Brady and Manning to Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, or Messi and Ronaldo, pairings in which two generational talents elevated each other, and in doing so, elevated their entire sport. The intensity and the mutual escalation were the shared traits. Brady's newsletter, by revealing the internal machinery behind his half of the rivalry, offered a primary source explanation for how one half of one of those pairings actually worked from the inside. So the question the newsletter opens, and the question that drives everything that follows, is this: why would a man who won more than anyone in the history of his position need to invent disrespect that, by his own admission, may not have existed? Brady gave the league 7 Super Bowl titles and a resume without precedent. And yet his account of how he got there depends on a fiction he told himself about a man who, it turns out, may have respected him all along. The full version of that philosophy, the parts of the newsletter that went further than anyone expected, is where this story turns next. Enemies by design. To understand why Brady's 2025 admission landed the way it did, you have to sit with the exact language he used, because the philosophy he laid out was not a vague gesture toward competitiveness. It was a doctrine. Brady wrote that you have to allow your rivals to become your enemies, and the verb matters. He did not say rivals naturally become enemies. He said you allow it, you permit it, you make a choice to let the transformation happen inside your own head. The enmity was a decision, renewed across years. The doctrine had a second component that pushed it past simple motivation and into something closer to a code of conduct. Brady insisted the enemies had to be real ones. He wrote that they must become true enemies, in your mind and on the field. The phrase "in your mind" is the confession. Brady was describing an internal theater, a private staging of conflict, that had no necessary connection to how the other man actually felt. The enemy lived in Brady's head first, and only afterward took the field wearing an opposing jersey. What kept this from collapsing into pure hostility was the qualifier Brady attached. He stated that you can and should respect them, but that you cannot look at them as friendly competition. This is the precise line he was walking. Respect and enmity were not opposites in his system. They coexisted. The respect told him the rival was worth fearing, and the manufactured enmity converted that fear into the energy required to act on it. Friendliness, by contrast, was the one thing he could not allow, because friendliness would have lowered the stakes. The most revealing single line from the entire newsletter was not about Manning at all. It was about everyone. Brady disclosed that during his playing career, he had no real friends on any other teams, only teammates. Take that statement seriously, and the scale of the worldview becomes clear. This was not a special arrangement reserved for Manning. It was Brady's standing policy toward the entire population of the National Football League that did not share his locker room. The world divided into two groups, and almost everyone fell into the wrong one. That policy carried a cost, and Brady did not pretend otherwise. He acknowledged that the enemy framing produced real friction, that it generated some hurt feelings for a while. The cold posture he adopted toward rivals had consequences in the relationships those rivals might otherwise have offered. Brady was not describing a victimless strategy. He was describing one that asked him to forgo connection with the very peers who understood his life better than anyone, and to do so for as long as the competition lasted. And yet the through line of the newsletter was gratitude, not regret. And this is where the doctrine becomes most counterintuitive. Brady did not frame the lost friendships and the manufactured hostility as a price he wished he had not paid. He framed the entire arrangement, Manning included, as a gift to his NFL career. The hostility was not a regrettable side effect of greatness. In Brady's telling, it was a precondition of it. He would not unwind it even with the benefit of hindsight, because the version of him that won 7 titles was built out of exactly this material. The gift, mechanically, was discipline. Brady explained that the existence of a specific enemy forced a specific behavior, and that behavior was preparation in the absence of an audience. The rival drove him to work when nobody was watching. This is a more sophisticated claim than simple motivation. Anyone can be motivated on game day when the lights are on and the stakes are obvious. Brady was describing the harder problem, the problem of sustaining intensity through the empty months and quiet hours, where no one would ever know whether he had pushed himself or coasted. The enemy solved that problem by always being out there, always preparing, always a reason. Brady went further and tied the enemy directly to his own self-expectation. He wrote that the rivalry forced him to raise the standard he held himself to push it above and beyond what others thought was possible. The external doubt about a 6th-round pick became, through this mechanism, an internal demand. Manning's excellence set a bar, and Brady's manufactured need to surpass a manufactured enemy pulled that bar higher than the consensus believed a quarterback of his draft position had any business reaching. The fiction produced a real result. It is worth pausing on what Brady was actually confessing here, because the structure of it is unusual. Most athletes who describe motivation point to something external that genuinely happened. A slight, a snub, a coach who doubted them, a draft slide that wounded their pride. Brady's draft slide was real, but the disrespect from Manning specifically was not something he claimed actually occurred. He claimed he authored it. He generated the offense in his own mind, and then spent years responding to an insult that, by his own qualifier, he was not sure had ever been delivered. To explain that this was not a personal eccentricity, Brady reached for company, and the company he chose was instructive. He invoked Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Tiger Woods, Nolan Ryan, and Roger Clemens, 5 figures from 3 different sports united by a reputation for a near-pathological drive to win. These were not chosen at random. Each of them was famous, in their own way, for treating competition as something closer to war than to sport, and several were known specifically for inventing slights to fuel themselves. Brady was claiming membership in a particular fraternity of obsessives. The Jordan comparison in particular did real work because it was already part of the cultural vocabulary. Jordan's habit of taking innocuous comments from opponents and transforming them into personal vendettas was so well documented it had become a punchline. Brady, by aligning himself with that lineage, was signaling that the enemy framing was not a confession of insecurity, but a credential of greatness. The very strangeness of the behavior was the point. Ordinary competitors do not need to invent enemies, historic ones. in Brady's account do. This is where the climax of the newsletter sits and where the central tension of the entire story sharpens. Brady was simultaneously telling two stories that should not fit together. In one, Manning was the enemy, the manufactured threat, the man Brady refused to befriend so that he could keep beating him. In the other, Manning was the gift, the resource, the reason Brady became the player he became. Brady was not resolving that tension. He was insisting that both were true, that the enemy and the gift were the same person, and that this was not a contradiction, but the actual mechanism of elite performance. What gives the admission its weight is the asymmetry between the two men's recollections, which the surrounding context makes visible. Brady was describing a private war he waged largely inside his own skull. There is little indication that Manning was running a parallel program of equal intensity in the other direction. The respect Brady felt was, by his own account, genuine and growing. The hostility was the constructed layer he placed over that respect. So the rivalry, at the level of internal experience, may not have been symmetrical at all. One man may have been at war, while the other was simply playing football very well. The newsletter also clarified the timeline of Brady's own emotions in a way that complicates the tidy narrative. The respect, he said, was always there and grew over time. So Brady was not a man who hated Manning and later came to respect him. He was a man who respected Manning the entire time and chose to suppress that respect in service of competition. The order matters. The friendship that the public saw after retirement was not a transformation. It was the surfacing of something that had been present all along, finally permitted to exist now that the enemy no longer needed to. There is a darker reading available, and the coverage that followed did not shy away from it. If Brady could generate a complete adversarial relationship out of nothing, sustain it for 15 years, and feel grateful for it afterward, then the line between competitive drive and something more troubling becomes blurry. The capacity to manufacture hatred on demand, to deploy it precisely and then retract it once it has served its purpose, is not a comfortable trait. It is effective, by Brady's accounting overwhelmingly so, but effectiveness and comfort are different things. Brady himself seemed aware of how the admission would read, which is part of why he framed it as universal rather than personal. By insisting that every champion needs a rival, by titling the post around that claim, he was attempting to convert a potentially unsettling confession into a piece of wisdom. The message was not, "I did something strange." The message was, "This is what greatness requires, and I am simply describing it honestly." Whether the reader accepted that framing or recoiled from it was, in a sense, the test the newsletter posed. The honesty itself was the departure. For a man whose post-football life had been built on endorsements, broadcasting, and a carefully tended public image, choosing to describe the manufactured enmity at all was a risk. He could have left the comfortable narrative untouched. The two respectful rivals who became friends was a story that served everyone, sold well, and required no further explanation. Brady chose instead to reach underneath it and expose the harder machinery, and he did so in his own publication, on his own terms, with no interviewer to soften or redirect the conversation. That choice of venue is itself part of the story. The newsletter format meant there was no filter between Brady's thinking and the page. There was no journalist to frame the quotes, no producer to cut for time, no network to worry about how it played. The 199 platform gave Brady a direct channel, and the enemy admission was among the first major uses of that channel that revealed something the public did not already know. It was Brady editing his own narrative rather than responding to someone else's questions about it. So the doctrine, fully assembled, looks like this. Allow your rivals to become true enemies in your mind. Respect them, but never permit the respect to soften into friendliness while the competition is live. Use the manufactured enmity to drive preparation in private, to raise your standard above what others believe possible, and to beat the rival more often than he beats you. Accept the hurt feelings as a cost, and afterward recognize the whole arrangement, enemy and all, as a gift. That is the system Brady credited for his career, but a doctrine is only as convincing as the results it produced, and Brady's results were the 17 meetings themselves. The philosophy means little without the battles that tested it. The enemy framing was built to win specific games against a specific man, and those games were among the most consequential the sport produced in its era. What actually happened across those 17 confrontations, the comebacks and collapses and championship-deciding stands, is the evidence on which Brady's entire account rests. And the strangest part is that the man who designed his whole psychology around beating Manning did not always win. 17 battles. The rivalry that Brady built his psychology around stretched across 17 meetings between 2001 and 2015. And the sheer span of it is part of what made it singular. Most great sports rivalries burn intensely for a few seasons and then fade as one party declines. This one refused to end. It survived coaching changes, roster overhauls, an injury that nearly finished Manning's career, and a franchise change that moved the rivalry from Indianapolis to Denver. For 15 years, the schedule kept producing reasons for these two men to stand on opposite sidelines. The final tally favored Brady, who finished with an 11-6 edge across all meetings. But the headline number conceals the texture underneath it, and the texture is where the rivalry earned its reputation. Brady's dominance was concentrated in particular conditions. He went 9-3 in the regular season against Manning, a lopsided figure that speaks to how reliably he handled these games when the structure of the season brought them together. The regular season meetings were where Brady's manufactured enemy delivered most consistently. The home field split was even more pronounced. At Foxborough, in front of his own crowd, and in the conditions he knew best, Brady was 8-2 against Manning. The New England weather, the December cold that punished visiting offenses, and the familiarity of his own building combined to make Brady nearly unbeatable at home in this matchup. If the rivalry had been played entirely in Massachusetts, it would not have been a rivalry at all. It would have been a procession. But the rivalry was not played entirely in Massachusetts, and that is precisely why it remained a rivalry. Manning held meaningful advantages in the settings that fell outside Brady's comfort zone. On the road and in certain postseason contexts, Manning won key instances of the head-to-head series, including in the AFC Championship game on multiple occasions. The games that decided who advanced to the Super Bowl did not always break Brady's way, and those were the games that carried the most weight in any honest accounting of the two careers. The pattern that emerged across their playoff meetings became one of the rivalry's defining features. In the AFC Championship games between these two quarterbacks, the home team kept winning. The venue, more than the matchup itself, often dictated the outcome of the biggest games. This gave every regular season result a second layer of meaning, because seeding and home field advantage in the postseason frequently came down to who had won the head-to-head battles earlier in the year. Brady's regular season dominance was not just about pride. It was about securing the right to host the games that mattered most. The early chapters of the rivalry belonged almost entirely to Brady, and they belonged to him in a way that shaped the narrative for years. In 2001, Brady's first season as a starter, the Patriots won both regular season meetings against Manning's Colts and went on to win Super Bowl XXXV. The rivalry ignited with Brady on top, an unranked 6th-round pick, outplaying the no-one overall selection. And that origin set the tone for how the matchup would be framed by media and fans for the remainder of the decade. The 2003 and 2004 seasons deepened Brady's early advantage and added a postseason dimension. The teams met in the AFC Championship game, which the Patriots won on their way to claiming back-to-back Super Bowl titles. In these clashes, Manning's offense ran into a New England defense engineered specifically to disrupt him, and the result was a series of costly interceptions thrown in the highest-stakes moments. The image of Manning undone by Patriots defenders in January became, for a time, the dominant picture of the rivalry, and it fed directly into the narrative Brady was constructing in his own head about who held the upper hand. But the rivalry was never going to belong to one man permanently, and the turn came in the middle of the decade. Manning began to get his first series wins, and the most iconic of them arrived in the 2006 AFC Championship game in Indianapolis. The Colts fell behind early, trailing by a substantial margin, and then mounted a comeback that reversed the entire emotional logic of the rivalry to that point. Manning led Indianapolis back, the Colts won, and they advanced to win Super Bowl XLI. For the first time, the man Brady had framed as inferior had beaten him on the sport's biggest conference stage. That 2006 comeback is one of the central events of the rivalry precisely because it broke the pattern that had defined it. For 5 years, the story had been Brady's mastery over a more celebrated opponent. The Indianapolis comeback rewrote that story in real time. Manning erased a deficit that had looked insurmountable, did it in a championship game, and did it against the defense and the quarterback who had tormented him for half a decade. The rivalry after that night was no longer a one-sided narrative. It was a genuine contest with evidence on both sides. Through the late 2000s, from roughly 2007 to 2010, the two continued to meet in the regular season, and the matchup settled into a sustained back and forth. Brady's Patriots often prevailed in these games, particularly at home, but Manning's Colts remained an elite operation that never went away. Neither team disappeared from contention, and neither quarterback declined enough to end the rivalry by attrition. They simply kept playing, kept winning their share, and kept giving Brady the renewable supply of competition that he later credited with sustaining his commitment. Then came the disruption that should have ended the rivalry entirely. Manning suffered a serious neck injury and missed an entire season, and the Colts, rebuilding around a new franchise quarterback, moved on from the player who had defined them. In 2012, Manning signed with the Denver Broncos. For most athletes, a major neck injury at Manning's age would have been a career-ending event. Instead, it relocated the rivalry. The same two quarterbacks who had defined the AFC in the 2000s were now positioned to define it again in the 2010s, this time with Manning wearing a different uniform in a different city. The Denver chapter produced a late career resurgence that few saw coming, and that added a final, dramatic act to the rivalry. From 2013 through 2015, Manning's Broncos won AFC championships in both 2013 and 2015, and crucially, they won them at home. The home team pattern that had governed the rivalry's postseason meetings held once again, and this time it held in Manning's favor. After years of losing the biggest games in Foxborough, Manning now had the home venue, the crowd, and the conditions, and he used them to send Brady's Patriots home twice in 3 years. The 2013 AFC Championship win sent Denver to the Super Bowl, and it reasserted Manning as a force in the rivalry at a stage of his career when he was supposed to be diminished. The neck injury had stripped away some of the arm strength that had once defined him, and yet he was beating Brady in conference championship games. This late resurgence is part of what made the rivalry so durable in the cultural memory. It did not end with a clear decline of one party. It ended with both men still competing for championships into the twilight of their careers. The final meeting between the two arrived in the 2015 AFC Championship game, which the Broncos won 20-18. It was a tight, grinding game, decided by a narrow margin, fitting for a rivalry that had so often come down to small differences in execution and circumstance. Denver advanced, and Manning went on to win Super Bowl 50 in what would be the final game of his career. The man Brady had spent 15 years framing as an enemy walked off the field for the last time as a champion, having beaten Brady in their final confrontation. That ending carries a particular irony in light of the 2025 newsletter. Brady's entire psychological framework was built around beating Manning more often than Manning beat him. And on the broad scoreboard, he succeeded, finishing 11-6. But the final meeting, the last word in the 17-game series, belonged to Manning. The enemy Brady constructed got the closing victory and got it on the way to a championship that capped his career. The rivalry did not end with Brady proving his manufactured point. It ended with the man he framed as inferior holding the trophy. It is worth noting that Brady was not idle during the Denver years, and his own crowning achievements punctuated the rivalry's final act. In the 2014 season, between Manning's two AFC championship wins, Brady led the Patriots to a Super Bowl licks-likes title of his own. So the late period of the rivalry was not a story of Manning's ascendance and Brady's decline. It was a story of two aging greats trading championships, each one refusing to cede the stage, each one adding to a resume that would fuel debate for decades. The interleaving of their titles is part of why the rivalry resists a simple verdict. The structure of these 17 meetings explains something important about Brady's later admission. The reason he needed a manufactured enemy was that the real one kept refusing to stay beaten. If Brady had simply dominated Manning across the board, there would have been no rivalry, no sustained tension, and no need for the elaborate psychological apparatus he described. It was precisely because Manning kept winning the games that mattered most, the conference championships and the final meeting, that Brady could never relax, never assume superiority, and never stop manufacturing the urgency that drove his preparation. This is the evidence on which Brady's doctrine rests, and the evidence is genuinely mixed. The enemy framing produced an 11-6 record and dominance at home, which is a real result. But it did not produce dominance in the moments Brady cared about most, the postseason meetings where Manning won his share and took the final word. The strategy worked, but it did not work completely, and the gaps in its success are arguably what kept it necessary. A perfectly effective enemy framing would have eliminated the rivalry. An imperfectly effective one sustained it for 15 years. The comparison to other great sporting rivalries becomes more apt the closer you look at the structure, like Magic and Bird or Messi and Ronaldo. The Brady-Manning rivalry was defined not by one party's superiority, but by sustained mutual elevation. Each man's excellence demanded a response from the other, and the responses compounded across years into a body of work that neither could have produced alone. Brady's newsletter gave this dynamic a name and a mechanism. The mutual elevation that observers saw from the outside was, from Brady's side, the product of a deliberately manufactured enmity that kept him reaching. But to understand why this rivalry carried such weight, why a sixth-round pick beating a no-one overall selection became the story of an era, you have to go back to where it started. The 17 meetings make sense only against the backdrop of how improbably the two men arrived at them. One was anointed from the moment he entered the league. The other was an afterthought who was not supposed to be on the field at all. The gap between those two origins is the foundation of everything Brady later built in his own mind. And the story of how that gap formed contains a betrayal, an injury, and a leaked email that nobody saw coming. From 199 to forever. To understand the chasm that Brady spent 15 years exploiting in his own imagination, you have to return to the spring of 1998, to a draft in which Peyton Manning was the surest thing the league had seen in years. The Indianapolis Colts held the first pick, and they used it to take Manning no one overall. He arrived as football royalty in every sense the word could carry. The son of a celebrated NFL quarterback, a record-shattering star at the University of Tennessee, a young man whose command of the position was so complete that scouts struggled to find a flaw worth mentioning. He was not a projection. He was a certainty. Manning's pedigree was the kind that opens every door before the man even reaches it. He came out of the Southeastern Conference, the most punishing crucible in college football, having already proven he could read defenses with the fluency of a coach. His arm talent was elite. His football intelligence was spoken of in reverent tones, and his leadership was treated as a settled fact rather than a question to be answered. When he walked into the Colts facility, the franchise reoriented itself around him immediately. There was no competition for the job, no apprenticeship, no doubt. The throne was waiting, and Manning simply sat down in it. 2 years later, and in a different universe entirely, a quarterback from the University of Michigan sat in a draft room's purgatory, watching his name go uncalled through round after round. The Patriots eventually selected Tom Brady with the 199th overall pick in the 2000 NFL Draft, a sixth-round selection so deep into the proceedings that it carried no expectations at all. 6 other quarterbacks were taken before him. He was the kind of pick a team makes to fill out a roster, a developmental flyer who might earn a clipboard if he was lucky, and a roster spot if he worked hard enough to deserve one. The contrast between the two arrivals could not have been more total, and it is the raw material out of which Brady later forged his entire psychology. Manning was handed everything the league had to offer before he played a snap. Brady was handed nothing and told by the very structure of the draft that the football world did not believe in him. One man was the answer to a franchise's prayers. The other was a name scribbled near the bottom of a draft board, a player most evaluators had already forgotten by the time he was selected. That gap was real, it was documented, and it was permanent. What turned Brady's afterthought status into opportunity was not a meritocratic competition won cleanly, but a moment of misfortune that belonged to someone else. Early in the 2001 season, Brady took over as the Patriots starter after Drew Bledsoe's injury. Bledsoe was the established franchise quarterback, the player the team had built around, and his injury opened a door that Brady was never supposed to walk through. The sixth-round afterthought stepped onto the field by accident of circumstance, and what happened next rewrote the expected order of the entire league. Brady did not merely hold the position until Bledsoe recovered. He seized it permanently and drove the Patriots to an improbable Super Bowl XXDEI win in that very first season as a starter. The man drafted 199th, the player nobody wanted, won a championship before the man drafted first overall had won anything at all. The inversion was complete and immediate, and it planted the seed of every narrative that would follow. The afterthought had a ring, the certainty did not, and from that disorienting reversal, the rivalry's central tension was born. This origin story is the foundation of Brady's manufactured enemy, and understanding it clarifies why the framing felt so natural to him. Brady did not have to invent the disrespect from scratch. The disrespect was structurally real. The league had told him, in the clearest language available to it, that he was the 199th best prospect in his class. What Brady invented was the specific attribution of that disrespect to Manning, the imagined notion that Manning thought he was better because he was a no-one pick from an SEC school. The wound was genuine, Brady simply chose Manning as the face to project onto it. The pedigree gap also explains the particular shape of the media narratives that surrounded the rivalry for years, narratives that Brady would have absorbed and metabolized into fuel. For much of the early period, certain corners of the football world positioned Manning as the more complete quarterback, the more statistically prolific passer, the more naturally gifted talent who simply lacked the team success Brady enjoyed. The framing of stats versus rings, of natural ability versus winning, became a permanent feature of how the two were discussed, and it gave Brady a steady supply of perceived slights to incorporate into his constructed enmity. But the backstory of this rivalry is not only a tale of draft position and championship timing. Buried within it is a far stranger episode, one that briefly turned the manufactured enemy into something resembling a real one, and then resolved in a way that exposed how thin the actual hostility between the two men always was. The episode arrived during one of the most chaotic periods of Brady's career, and it involved a private email that was never meant to see daylight. During the Deflategate saga that consumed Brady and the Patriots in 2015, a piece of private correspondence leaked into public view. In the email, Brady had privately estimated the remaining length of the two quarterbacks' careers, suggesting that Manning had about 2 years left, while he himself had 7 or 8. It was the kind of candid, slightly cutting assessment that people make in private and never expect to defend in public. Stripped of context and broadcast to the world, it read like a quarterback dismissing his great rival, calculating Manning's expiration date with cold precision. The leak placed Brady in an awkward position, and his response revealed something about the actual relationship beneath the manufactured one. Brady apologized for the email, treating the private remark as something that warranted contrition once it became public. This is not the behavior of a man who genuinely viewed Manning as an enemy to be vanquished. An authentic enemy would not have merited an apology. The apology suggested that the underlying respect Brady later described in his newsletter was operating even here, that the enemy framing was a competitive tool rather than a true emotional state. Manning's response to the leaked email is perhaps the single most revealing moment in the entire backstory, because it demonstrated how asymmetrical the rivalry actually was at the level of genuine feeling. Manning publicly defended Brady and called any apology unnecessary. The man Brady had spent years framing as a disrespectful enemy responded to a genuine slight by waving it off, by refusing to take offense, by extending grace at the exact moment he had every right to take umbrage. The manufactured enemy, when handed a real reason to be hostile, declined the invitation entirely. That moment exposes the central fiction of Brady's entire psychological apparatus. While Brady was internally constructing Manning as a man who looked down on him, who thought himself superior, who needed to be proven wrong, the actual Manning was a person who defended Brady publicly and dismissed the need for an apology. The enemy existed only in Brady's mind. The real man across the field was, by all available evidence, gracious, generous, and entirely uninterested in the war Brady was waging in private. The asymmetry could hardly be starker. The Deflategate email episode also adds a layer of irony that compounds across the years. Brady's private estimate, the cutting little calculation about who had more time left, turned out to be wrong in a particular way. Manning did retire roughly on the timeline Brady predicted, but he retired as a champion, having won the final meeting between them and a Super Bowl to close his career. Brady's longer timeline came true as well, but the prediction that read as dismissive in 2015 became, in retrospect, simply a frank assessment between two men who knew the brutal arithmetic of an aging quarterback's career better than anyone alive. What makes this backstory disruptive rather than merely informational is how completely it undercuts the enemy framing when examined closely. Every piece of genuine interaction between the two men points toward mutual respect and even warmth. The apology, the gracious dismissal, the absence of any documented real hostility from Manning's side. The only place the enmity lived was inside Brady's head, where he had installed it deliberately, maintained it carefully, and deployed it precisely for 15 years before retiring it the moment it was no longer useful. The pedigree gap, the Bledsoe accident, the improbable Super Bowl, the leaked email, and Manning's grace under it all combine into a portrait of a rivalry that was, at the level of fact, far more cordial than Brady's later doctrine implied. The competition was ferocious. The 17 meetings were genuinely contested and genuinely consequential. But the personal animosity that Brady described as essential to his success appears to have been almost entirely a product of his own manufacture, sustained against a man who never returned to hostility, and who, when given the chance to do so, chose grace instead. This is the background that makes the 2025 newsletter so much more complex than its headline suggested. Brady was not breaking silence on a feud. There was no feud to break silence on, not a real one. He was revealing the existence of a private psychological tool, an internal fiction he had run for the duration of his career, and he was disclosing it about a man who had only ever treated him with respect. The enemy was never real. The respect always was. And that inversion sets up the final and most surprising turn in the entire story. Because the public version of the Brady-Manning relationship that followed their retirements was not a reconciliation between former enemies. It was the surfacing of a friendship that had, in a sense, been waiting beneath the manufactured hostility the entire time. The smiling photographs, the charity golf, the Hall of Fame appearances, the warm words traded in interviews. All of it raises a question that reframes the newsletter itself. If the enemy was always a fiction and the respect was always real, then what exactly was Brady breaking his silence about in 2025? And was it ever really silence at all? Friends, this whole time, the truth that the manufactured enmity had always concealed began to surface publicly the moment both men stopped playing. And the surfacing was immediate and unmistakable. In 2019, the two posted a photograph together, accompanied by a caption that functioned as a quiet correction to the entire narrative the public had absorbed across 2 decades. The line read, "We were friends this whole time." Spoiler alert, it began before delivering the revelation that the two rivals had never actually been the adversaries everyone assumed they were. The caption was light, almost a throwaway joke, but it carried a deeper accuracy than its casual tone suggested. After 15 years of fans choosing sides, of arguments in bars and on broadcasts about who was truly superior, the two principal figures in the drama were quietly informing the world that the war had been less real than it looked. That phrase, "friends this whole time," deserves to be taken at face value rather than dismissed as retirement-era revisionism, because the entire documented backstory supports it completely. The grace Manning extended during the Deflategate email leak, the respect Brady later admitted, had always been present beneath the surface. The apology Brady offered for a private remark that was never meant to be public. All of it indicates that the friendship was not invented after the careers ended. It was uncovered, excavated from beneath the competitive apparatus that had buried it. The enemy framing had been a layer Brady placed on top of a relationship that, underneath, had always been fundamentally cordial. Once the competition ended and the manufactured hostility lost its purpose, the layers simply dissolved. And what remained was the thing that had been there all along. The post-career relationship deepened quickly and visibly, accelerating in the years immediately following both men's exits from the field. In 2020, the two participated in The Match, a charity golf event that paired them alongside Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson for a nationally televised exhibition. The event placed Brady and Manning on the same side, partners rather than opponents, swapping jokes and missed putts and self-deprecating commentary for an audience that had only ever seen them locked in opposition. The sight of the two men relaxed in each other's company, entirely free of the competitive stakes that had defined every previous encounter between them, offered the public its first sustained look at the rapport that the enemy framing had kept carefully hidden for the better part of 15 years. The warmth extended into the most ceremonial moment of Manning's post-career life, the kind of occasion that reveals who a person truly values. When Manning was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2021, Brady attended the ceremony to honor the man he had once framed as an enemy in the privacy of his own mind. The gesture was significant precisely because of what it represented and what it cost in terms of narrative consistency. Brady traveled to celebrate the career of his great rival, to sit in the audience and applaud the achievements of the player, whose excellence he had spent a decade and a half manufacturing reasons to resent. The enemy he had constructed had become, in the clear light of retirement, a man worth honoring in person, in public, on the day that mattered most to him. Manning, for his part, returned the warmth with the dry, deadpan humor that had always been a defining feature of his public persona, the comic timing that made him one of the most recognizable figures in American sports beyond the field itself. At the induction, Manning joked about Brady's own future Hall of Fame speech in 2035 being an Instagram post rather than a traditional spoken address, a gentle ribbing about Brady's remarkable longevity and the shifting media landscape both men now navigated in their second acts. The joke worked precisely because it came from a place of genuine affection rather than rivalry. This was not the careful banter of former enemies performing civility for the cameras. It was the easy, unforced teasing of two men who understood each other deeply, and who by this point clearly enjoyed each other's company without reservation. The depth of Brady's actual feeling toward Manning, stripped entirely of the competitive framing he had imposed during their playing years, came through with striking clarity in his retirement-era reflections. Brady described Manning as someone he always just admired as a quarterback, as a leader whose teams were always in contention, and who consistently represented the best the league had to offer in any given season. This is the language of admiration, plainly stated, with no trace of animosity anywhere in it. The same man who had manufactured a 15-year enemy could not, once the competition had ended, locate a single hostile word to say about the person he had cast in that adversarial role. The admiration was the truth of the matter. The enmity, by contrast, had only ever been the tool. When Brady's 2025 newsletter finally landed, the public reaction reflected an audience working to reconcile this widely visible warmth with the cold internal mechanics. Brady was now describing for the first time, and the responses clustered around a few clearly identifiable themes. A significant portion of the reaction expressed genuine appreciation for the honesty of the disclosure, framing the manufactured enemy as a healthy and even necessary feature of competition at the highest level. One widely shared sentiment held that creating an enemy out of your rival in sports is healthy, pointing to Ronaldo and Messi as a directly comparable dynamic in which two generational talents pushed each other to greater heights, through sustained, structured opposition that neither could have generated alone. The comparison that surfaced most frequently in these reactions was to Michael Jordan, and specifically to Jordan's famously documented habit of inventing slights, grudges, and imagined disrespect to fuel his own competitive engine. Commenters repeatedly noted that Brady's confession was truly sociopath stuff, but effective, a phrase that captured the precise mixture of unease and admiration that the admission produced in roughly equal measure across the audience. The capacity to manufacture hatred on demand, to sustain it across years against a man who had done nothing to earn it, and then to retract it cleanly once it had served its purpose was widely recognized as something genuinely unsettling. But it was also recognized as a trait conspicuously shared by many of the most accomplished competitors in the entire history of professional sport. The strangeness in this reading was not a bug. It was the credential. Another prominent strand of reaction managed to hold both the competitive hostility and the underlying genuine respect in view simultaneously, which is arguably the most accurate reading of the entire situation that the public produced. A frequently echoed sentiment captured it with blunt economy. Manning seems like the kind of guy you'd love to have as a friend or neighbor, but he can suck a fat egg on the football field. Hate the player, respect the man. This crude but precise formulation articulated almost exactly the distinction Brady himself had drawn in his newsletter, the careful separation between the respect that was always present beneath the surface and the enmity he chose to deploy only during the hours of active competition. The fans, in their own vernacular, had independently arrived at Brady's own doctrine. Not all of the reaction was admiring, and the dissenting voices raised a question that cuts at the foundation of Brady's whole self-presentation. A minority response questioned the value of revisiting the dynamic years after both men had comfortably retired, viewing the made-myself-believe admission as a window into unnecessary insecurity rather than confident, secure competitiveness. If Brady had to invent disrespect that did not actually exist in order to perform at his peak, this skeptical reading went. Then perhaps the manufactured enemy revealed a fragility hiding beneath the historic dominance, a need for external validation so deep that he had to fabricate the threat himself. Others firmly rejected that interpretation, seeing the candor instead as authentic and self-aware, a rare moment of genuinely unfiltered honesty in a modern sports culture, increasingly defined by relentless image management and performative friendliness. The broader narrative that the newsletter immediately refreshed was the perennial, never quite settled debate over which of the two quarterbacks was actually the better player. A debate the admission did nothing to resolve and arguably complicated further. The reaction surfaced all the familiar fault lines that had divided fans for 2 decades. Some continued to push Manning as the more statistically prolific or more naturally gifted passer, particularly in the earlier portion of their overlapping careers, citing his record-setting offenses and his command of the position. Others credited Brady's sustained excellence across an unprecedented span and his vastly superior championship hardware. Brady's confession added a genuinely new wrinkle to this exhausted debate by suggesting that Manning's perceived superiority, whether real or entirely imagined, had been the very fuel that drove Brady to surpass him in the categories that ultimately decided the argument. There was also a quieter, more thoughtful strain of reaction that found something close to poignant in the dynamic, a recognition that the rivalry had been profoundly generative for both men rather than merely combative. One reading held that without the Mannings, Brady wouldn't have played as long, that the rivalry turned him into a competitor obsessed with proving everyone wrong, reshaping his entire psychology in the process. In this generous framing, the manufactured enemy was not a character flaw to be diagnosed, but the actual engine of a career without precedent in the sport. Manning's excellence, by perpetually demanding a response, extended Brady's commitment across 2 full decades, when most quarterbacks fade after one. The gift that Brady described in his newsletter was, in this interpretation, entirely real, and the fans who recognized it had understood the rivalry better than the breathless headlines did. It is worth dwelling on how the various platforms processed the admission differently, because the fragmentation of the reaction tells its own story about how this rivalry lived in the public imagination. The most engaged and detailed discussion clustered in dedicated football communities, where fans cross-referenced specific games, specific drives, and specific seasons to test Brady's claims against the actual record. These were not casual reactions. They were the responses of an audience that had watched all 17 meetings, that remembered the 2006 Indianapolis comeback and the 2015 conference championship and the cold December games in Foxborough. And that brought genuine expertise to the question of whether Brady's manufactured enemy had actually produced the results he credited it with. The broader social platforms, by contrast, traded more in nostalgia and tangential comparisons, using the newsletter as a launching point for arguments about the current generation of quarterbacks, rather than a close reading of Brady's exact words. That generational comparison became one of the most revealing threads in the entire reaction, because it exposed something the audience seemed to sense intuitively. Part of what made the Brady-Manning rivalry so resonant was that it appeared increasingly difficult to replicate in the modern game, where the friendly, mutually supportive relationships between star quarterbacks stood in deliberate contrast to the manufactured enmity Brady was describing. The current era's stars often praise one another openly, train together in the offseason, and reject the adversarial posture entirely. Brady's newsletter, intentionally or not, functioned as an argument from an older school of competition, a suggestion that the warmth on display among today's stars might come at a cost that his own generation refused to pay. Whether that argument held water was beside the point. What mattered was that the audience recognized it as a genuine philosophical divide between 2 eras of the sport. Now, the twist that the entire structure has been quietly building toward. The verdict that an honest and careful accounting of the facts ultimately delivers once all the evidence is assembled. The title of the coverage that drove this story framed it as Brady finally breaking his silence about Manning, as though a long-suppressed and bitter feud had at last been confessed to a waiting public. But the research simply does not support the premise that there was ever any silence to break in the first place. Brady had been candid about Manning before, repeatedly, and on the record, most notably in the Deflategate email and in his many public expressions of admiration over the years. And the 2025 newsletter itself was not a confrontation, a call-out or a confession of hidden hatred suddenly released. It was a reflective post in his personal newsletter, composed at leisure, framed deliberately around a general philosophy of competition rather than a specific grievance. The deeper inaccuracy buried in the breaking silence framing is that there was never an enemy to confess in the first place. The entire backstory, examined honestly, demonstrates that the hostility was a private psychological tool rather than a genuine emotional state, a mechanism deployed against a man who never once returned it, and who, when handed a real and legitimate reason to take offense during the email leak, chose grace instead. Brady was not revealing a feud that had been simmering beneath the surface. He was describing a technique, a method, a deliberate piece of internal engineering. The man he had framed as an enemy had defended him publicly when he had every right not to, had shared nothing but warmth with him across every documented post-career interaction, and had joined him for charity golf and Hall of Fame ceremonies. The silence the headline promised was a fiction layered on top of a friendship that had, as the 2019 caption put it so plainly, existed this whole time. So what actually happened in July of 2025 was simultaneously less dramatic and considerably more interesting than the headline suggested to anyone who clicked on it, expecting a bombshell. Brady did not break a silence, because there was no feud being silenced and no grudge being held. Instead, he pulled back the curtain on the internal machinery of his own greatness, on the deliberate, repeatable manufacture of motivation that he credited for an entire career without parallel. The genuine revelation was not that he hated Manning, because he plainly did not and never had. The revelation was that he chose to simulate hatred toward a man he respected and admired, sustained that simulation for 15 years, and considered the entire process absolutely essential to becoming the most accomplished quarterback in the history of his sport. The enemy was always imaginary. The achievement constructed on top of it was entirely, measurably real. The lasting meaning of the whole story sits precisely in that gap between the manufactured enemy and the genuine friend. And it is a gap that reveals something uncomfortable but illuminating about excellence at the absolute highest level of human competition. Brady's willingness to construct a complete fiction, to suppress real and growing respect in service of winning, and then to feel sincere gratitude for the whole strange arrangement afterward, is arguably what separated him from the many talented competitors who could not or simply would not do the same. The 17 meetings, the 11-6 head-to-head record, the near-total dominance at home, and the painful, championship-deciding losses on the road, all of it was filtered through a psychology that Brady built deliberately, maintained meticulously, and then dismantled completely the moment it stopped being useful to him. And perhaps the most genuinely human detail in the entire saga is the one that brings it to a close. The image that lingers after all the records and reactions have faded. The two men who spent 15 years standing on opposite sidelines, one of them privately at war with a phantom version of the other that existed nowhere but inside his own head, ended up as friends who unmistakably enjoyed each other's company in the years that followed. The rivalry that defined an entire era of professional football was, beneath the carefully manufactured enmity, a relationship of deep mutual admiration that simply had to wait for the competition to end before it could finally be admitted out loud. Brady built an enemy in order to win, and win he did. When the winning was finally done, the enemy he had built dissolved into nothing, and the friend who had been standing there the whole time was at last allowed to stay. References Tom Brady. Every champion needs a rival. 199 newsletter. July 21, 2025. An NBC Sports Pro Football Talk coverage of Brady's enemy comments. Wikipedia. Tom Brady-Peyton Manning rivalry. Head-to-head record. Timeline. Key games. Deflectgate email. Post-career interactions. Reddit RP Patriots discussion thread on Brady considering Manning an enemy. https://www.reddit.com/rpatriotscomcamos1L63azz Brady considered Peyton